All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming on a Friday. Here we have Dr. Brenda Lara, who's going to be speaking about epistemic haunting. Dr. Lara was at UCLA, getting a PhD recently, was a McNair Scholar, which is a very prestigious scholar position. And now she has this prestigious postdoc at UC Santa Cruz. It's called the Presidential Postdoc. We're very lucky to have her here to give this talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lara.
All right, really. Thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. You probably have much better things to do, but I hope I can excite you at least for a little bit with hauntings. So the title of this piece, Epistemic Haunting, Archiving Epistemologies, Chicana Ghosts, and Haunted Histories. Like was said, I am Dr. Brenda Lara, and I just want to take a moment for us to look at this particular cover. This art piece by Chicana visual artist Delilah Montoya will really give you like subtle hints as to what this presentation is going to be about. This piece is called La Llorona in Lilith's Garden. And you'll see here the figure of the weeping woman as she's making her way as a hidden figure. And we're going to deconstruct this in a little bit. All right, damn. You can just keep on going. Sorry, it's a lot. All right, so I'll give you all a quick roadmap so we know where we're headed throughout this. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, my own positionality. We're going to talk about the academic haunted house. And then from there, I'm going to deconstruct what feminist hauntology and Chicana epistemology mean, alongside a couple other figures. It's all right. Alongside my theory of epistemic haunting, and apply that to archives and see what those living implications are. All right, so I am a Chicana from South Los Angeles. I grew up in a little town called Honeyland Park, that's better known as HP. And this really frames my identity, particularly as a queer Latina feminist theorist. I was the child of a single mother, working poor Mexican immigrant family. So I know what it's like to be delving into factories from your day to day. I know what it's like to see your parents work long hours, and you also live a first generation life as a college student. And this really frames me in terms of my academic position as a literary theorist, as a cultural historian, and as a philosopher. Particularly, I think of theory as something that should be accessible for everyone. It shouldn't be something that's really high and abstract. And rather, I think that we access knowledge through our own subjectivities. All right. So I'm going to kick us off with this one particular quote from this sociologist named Avery Gordon. In particular, she says, "Of course, the tricky thing is that scholars too are subject to these same dynamics of hauntings. Ghosts get in our matters just as well. This means that we will have to learn to talk and listen to ghosts rather than banish them as a precondition for establishing our scientific or humanistic knowledge." So essentially what she's saying is that as academics, as scholars, we have a lot of histories of repression that we need to talk about. There's a lot of stuff that we hide in the shadows. And if we're going to do anything to actually change knowledge, to change higher education, we need to start listening to those ghosts. We need to start listening to those hidden histories. And this is what this talk is going to be about. I'm going to go ahead, you can go to the next one. I'm going to go ahead and try to answer Gordon's call to place ghost voices as a precondition for our scientific and humanist knowledge. I'm going to argue that epistemology, or just the study of knowledge in general, is integral to a ghost ontology, to its very being, its very essence. And as a result, I'm going to challenge academia to contend with 3 Latinx ghosts, with Laura Romero, a Stanford University professor, Horacio Roque Ramirez, a U.S. Central American historian, and Chicana feminist Gloria Anzaldúa. And not only with them, but also with their histories that have been repressed and the way they represent these histories. So if Gordon is asking, how do we learn to talk and listen to ghosts? My answer right now is hauntings have epistemological implications. So we have to learn to listen to them, but we also have to learn from them. And for this particular talk, I'm going to talk about one portion of this book project, and that's Lora. We're going to be focusing on the haunted house of Stanford University. So when we think of a haunted house, I want you to think of all of those conditions. I want you to think about like the movie The Conjuring or Paranormal Activity. Think about how a haunted house is spooky and how there are certain things about the haunted house that just freak us out. I'm going to argue that there are people of color who are represented by the ghosts who freak out the academy in the haunted house. But because there is a haunted house and because a haunted house is ultimately a home, we're going to talk about who is allowed in the home and who isn't. And that's how we're going to make that connection there. So from 1992 to 2000, we have President Gerard Casper, which is this dude right here, institutionalizing an era of white supremacy and heteropatriarchy throughout Stanford University. This exclusionary period was actually riddled with racial and gender discrimination. As during Casper's administration, you have women and people of color who suffered extreme setbacks because of a dissolving of diversity programs, because of low women of color hiring and retention rates, and because of the layoffs of Chicana faculty. In Stanford's departments, achievement was required only through a hidden support structure, which was inaccessible to people of color. And this haunting, I'm unearthing through several archival pieces, including one 1994 news clipping, where you see right here in these pictures, where you have 2 Chicana faculty and 2 staff members, Margarita Ibarra and Dean of Student Affairs Cecilia Burciaga, who were laid off after 2 decades of service. During this era, you have student leaders such as Roxana Vanessa Alvarado proclaiming that Chicanos and Chicanas were stepchildren of the university. So that's where they belonged within the realm of the haunted house, pushed to the side. This negligence would eventually lead to Chicana student protests, ultimately speaking against Casper's repressive policies. And among that was, the next slide. And among those consequences included the hiring of Chicano Latino faculty at Stanford, where Laura Romero, one more please, entered in 1993. In October 23, 1993, President Gerard and Provost Condoleezza Rice actually ended up praising new Chicano faculty with a reception. And even though events like this occurred in their honor, it didn't take away from the specter or the ghosts in the university. There was still racism, there was still sexism, there was still homophobia that persisted. During her time as an assistant professor at Stanford University's English department, Romero faced microaggressions that exacerbated her repression in academia. And though it's unclear exactly what led to her tenure denial and what prevented her promotion, there was an exemplification of epistemic violence that occurred. And it relates really to an extensive history of statistical data on women of color's presence in Stanford. In the 1990s, Stanford gained a reputation for denying women tenure, for not recruiting women, for not retaining women. And during this time, you had departments who had no tenured women from the 1980s to the 1990s. 40% of departments hadn't hired a woman within 5 years. And after the Chicano student protest, you see that faculty, particularly junior women, women of color faculty, saying that there was a complete loss of morale at the university. On October 10th, 1997, Stanford University would eventually be missing 1 woman of color from its campus. 33 miles away from Palo Alto's academic streets, the small coastal city of Pacifica, California had gained 1 occupant. This woman had checked into this motel with no intention of checking out. And that Friday in this unknown coastal city, Dr. Laura Romero ended her life. So I'm making the argument that there is a particular social violence that Dr. Laura Romero experienced in academia that embodies a phenomenon that I call epistemic haunting. And this particular haunting is reminiscent of La Llorona, or the weeping woman, a folklore that interlinks unresolved racialized, gendered, and sexual violence against Chicanexes and particularly Chicanx scholars. To do so, I'm looking at 2 lineages of thought. The first one being feminist hauntology. So hauntology comes from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida. It looks at repressed histories within the metaphor of the ghost or within haunting. I'm looking at a subfield within hauntology called feminist hauntology that really comes from a lineage of Black and Indigenous scholars who look at haunting to look at the violence that is occurring within women of color in our histories and in today. And to do so, to talk about haunting, we have to talk about ghosts. So if you've already kind of gotten a little hint of it, right? When you think about the haunted house in popular culture. But there's certain things about the ghost as a theoretical being. The ghost is someone or something that cannot stay buried. It can't stay hidden forever. It's a presence that has to be reckoned with. So if you mess with the ghost, you're gonna deal with the ghost. It's like in every horror movie when you see someone pull out the Ouija board and then they don't understand why something happened. Well, it's communicating back to you. And because I'm talking about these ghosts as people of color, and people of color already inhabit a very fluid, liminal, and ambiguous state of being, the ghost also does the same thing. We can't separate a living individual's identity from their identity once they have passed. I'm thinking about death in relation to other social death theorists, such as Sharon Holland, such as Lisa Cacho, who talk about living and death as something that can occur simultaneously. A lot of the times we think about them as two distinct boundaries, but we have to think about living and death together. So some of us may be living our lives right now physically, but we're dealing with death on our day-to-day. Whether that be because society has made us think about our own death, or because we're talking about death in relation to our loved ones, or because we're really not living to exist. We're just kind of going through the flow of things. And this is putting constraints on episteme or within bodies of knowledge, or who can at least access certain forms of episteme. Philosopher Miranda Fricker talks about the concept of epistemic injustice that recognizes oppression against knowledge producers as a type of injustice that wrongs specifically the capacity of the knower. Meaning that when people experience a form of epistemic injustice, they're not seen as a credible source legally. And I'm not the only scholar who also talks about how ghosts go through a denial of knowledge through death. Jose Medina talks about epistemic death as a loss or at least a radical curtailment of one's voice. And there's a large genealogy of Chicana and Latina feminists like Emma Perez, Sherry Moraga, Dina Gonzalez, and Mariana Ortega, whose literature offer resistant strategies that confront forms of epistemic violence, dehumanization, and repression. I particularly term epistemic haunting as a framework that unveils marginalized living and deceased individuals' suppressed histories and delegitimized knowledge to expose an ongoing injustice. In the epistemic haunting, knowledge dwells in the in-between spaces. Knowledge is ever engaging, even if it's subtly. And it's engaging not just with itself, in the archives that it lives, but with others in the world. Knowledge here is alive, even if its creator has passed away. And when we look at this particular picture of Margaret Jacks Hall, this is where the English department at Stanford University used to lie when Laura Romero is there. So even though she's passed away, we see the implications of like photography, for instance, that lie there. And we see hauntings and forms of knowledge production used through the metaphor of haunting throughout Chicana theorists. I'm not the first one to do this, but the difference is that you see figures of folklore be directly tied in terms of like analyzing folkloric literature to talk about Chicana Latina experiences. Figures like La Llorona, La Ciguanaba, La Malinche, and La Virgen de Guadalupe are among like the ghostly transnational symbols that help scrutinize Chicana's experiences particularly those of violence. And while La Llorona has several interpretations, like in Toni Morrison's Seth in Beloved, she's a mother who kills her children. And the popular depiction describes her as a ghostly woman who wanders the earth after drowning her children and committing suicide. La Llorona really is a ghost of representation for Chicanas and Latinas who are haunted by this mysterious woman. Chicanas have been arguably using La Llorona to be more than just a folktale, but more so a symbol throughout several forms of literature. Chicana writer Sandra Cisneros said that Chicanas are the daughters of La Llorona. Literary theorist Domino Perez talks about La Llorona as a theoretical method for creating meaning. And Alicia Gaspar de Alba talks about La Llorona as a border crosser. She's a modern day guide to the land of the dead. She bridges those two spheres, both metaphorically and in terms of a physical border crosser, because her stories come from Central America, Mexico to the United States and all around. And it's no coincidence that Romero's untimely death is a haunting reminiscent of La Llorona. Her haunting is interlinked with a genealogy of unresolved racialized, gendered, and sexualized repression. And just as La Llorona's narrative was initially utilized to promote forms of dehumanization, we'll see in the archive how Romero was dehumanized herself. Particularly, I'm going to be focusing on Romero's epistemic haunting in relation to 3 Llorona characteristics. First is repression resulting from a tragic consequence, such as death or a 10-year denial. A reclamation of voice and space in the afterlife. And lastly, repetition, a repetitive haunting that unveils and reframes the ghost narrative. My archival methodology is riddled with hauntings, meaning that I'm acknowledging and centering the ghosts who are sharing emotions in between the artifacts, whether that be periodicals, photographs, manuscripts. Particularly, I'm really gauging from Gordon's work that says that to study life, we must confront the ghostly aspects of it. There needs to be a confrontation of the way we know things and how we make knowledge. So this particular book project is a written portrayal of ghost watching. I vigilantly read perceptions of space and time with each scholar's literature and institutional archives to deconstruct and reconstruct their ghost stories. Through ghost watching, I detail the temporal and spatial absences, silences, and repressions that inhabit the in-between of each scholar's texts. And while I didn't have the privilege to meet these scholars while they were living, and I can't offer up a physical altar or altar, this particular project is a form of me creating an altar for Laura Romero. It came about from an actual brief conversation with Alicia Gaspar de Alba on the experiences of Latinas in higher education, where she briefly mentioned Laura Romero's existence and how she had been a woman who had taken her life in the 1990s. Years after Romero's death, rumors still circulated around ethnic studies circles that Romero had dealt with racism, among other forms of aggressions in her department. And while I was initially hesitant to research Laura Romero because her own positionality is very close to my own, I felt a commitment to understanding her ghost. Next slide. One more. Her epistemic haunting here is a metaphor for repression, but it's also a methodology that goes beyond the empirical to attend to memory's fragmentations. Here you'll see a list of a couple of the archival boxes that I went through. If you see closely, number 48, Laura Romero is the only folder with her name, but her archive is actually scattered throughout the El Centro Chicano collection. There are articles and ads from the Stanford Daily, which is the undergraduate newspaper, that show her presence. She was even an undergraduate at Stanford. And later, with her involvement as a faculty member, you see it throughout several Chicano organizations and not necessarily her English department. Among the organizations she was a part of, El Centro Chicano, the Chicano Student Center, Casa Zapata, the Chicano Housing Dorm, And these particular community centers were really a helpful guide to understanding the day-to-day traces that she left behind in the archives. In Laura's case, her memories exist in fragmentations. And over time, memories fade. As nonverbal entities, artifacts can only preserve and communicate with limitations. Nonetheless, the ghosts in her epistemic haunting are fragments that appear to make knowledge claims about her existence. When Laura's knowledge is repressed, epistemic hauntings bring her archival traces together. They connect these delicate, fragmented threads into an intricate, visible web. And one of the first pieces, these first fragmentations that I found was this 2014 town hall discussion addresses concerns about faculty diversity in Stanford University. It named a long lineage of professors of color who were denied tenure, many of who became prominent scholars in their fields. And among those names was Dr. Laura Romero. I bring up this moment here because it gives a perspective to my preliminary and historical narratives and the construction of these histories. Even though this article comes out of 2014 and is one of the more recent archival findings, it actually helped frame the earlier pieces from the 1990s and 80s. More so, it really is reminiscent of La Llorona cry, where we see Laura Romero's name being spoken for the first time in the same way that La Llorona would cry out. Going back to the Llorona characteristics that we saw earlier, this particular slide is going to see, you're going to see an embodiment of repression. The tenure process has the ability to break hearts, to trigger protests, and it shouldn't be taken lightly when framing Stanford's English department and the views on Laura's death. The department memorial statement, news release, memorial schedule for English department is a trace that reveals a glimpse as to how Romero experienced epistemic dehumanization. And it's important to highlight that Romero's passing occurred shortly after her tenure denial. Because epistemic violence interrogates a ghost's intellectual legacy after death, it's crucial to establish how Romero's intellectual capacities were framed after her passing. So in the English department memorial, you have faculty chair Terry Castle stating, the fact that her death was a suicide and the fact that we now know that she had so much sadness in her life makes it all the harder for us to bear. And while the memorial aims to announce Laura's death, Castle's statement distances Romero from her intellect and frames her solely as a deceased woman. By framing her sadness as a hidden entity, it also moves from accountability, as neither Stanford administrators nor faculty recognize the impact Stanford's academic boundaries may have had on Romero and other women faculty of colors. And though Terry Castle is herself a lesbian feminist scholar, the memorial invokes the settler moves to innocence strategy. The repressive presence attempts to distance Romero's emotions and death from university decisions precisely through the phrase, "we now know." The tenure denial and statements, "we now know," and so much sadness in her life demonstrate Romero's resemblance to La Llorona's first characteristic, the repression. By claiming ignorance, the statement minimizes the gravity of tenure denials and consequently the gravity of Romero's own epistemic violence. This news release positions Laura's repression as an individualistic emotional state rather than the repetitive pattern of tenure denials that exemplifies the epistemic violence in Stanford's haunting. The news release articulates Romero's suicide as a silent event that had shaken the English department. But the epistemic violence Romero faced was not a sudden event. And it should not be assumed that taking one's life is also sudden. It is an accumulation of violence towards the self. Even with constant resistance, years of enduring the university's epistemic violence can exorcise the ghosts from the haunted house. Romero and other faculty of color's tenure dismissals are attempts of systematic epistemic dehumanization. They are tactics to remove the ghost from an exclusionary home. So though the news release declares a shock towards her sadness, the ghosts in the archives offer knowledge that reveals that Romero's repression was, one, existed, and two, played a complex role that cannot be reduced to individualistic sadness. Instead, Romero's sadness threatens academic boundaries. Through the devaluing of Romero's interdisciplinary research, there's an indicator of epistemic violence. It also allowed her not to be silenced as a ghost in the academy, as we'll see in the next slide. Romero's literature helps her preserve her intellectual cries for justice. So as we see here in the quote slide, we're going to see a form of reclamation occurring through her literature. So even though she's passed away, she's still telling us how she feels about the academy. It's not like her sadness was unspoken. She had actually published her writing throughout ethnic studies, gender studies, literary, and history journals, where she critiqued US colonialism and academic exclusions. Her peer-reviewed publications demonstrate her Llorona characteristic. She refused to be repressed, even after she passed away. Precisely in this essay, When Something Goes Queer, Familiarity, Formalism, and Minority Intellectuals in the 1990s, she confronts Eurocentric epistemes in education and expresses her hope for a transformation in academia. When Something Goes Queer critiques academic institutions, first for categorical distinctions on knowledge, that devalue certain activist knowledge and intersectional knowledge. And she also speaks to the epistemic violence that she experienced by stating, quote, categorical distinction between the intellectual and the non-intellectual undermines the discourse of unauthorized speakers. She was aware of epistemic violence. And throughout this essay, she also deconstructs Chicana feminist Sherry Moraga's literature to contemplate the Chicano movement alongside heteronormativity. She talks about how heteronormativity is an quote unquote uncanny feeling of home becoming unfamiliar and queer. And Romero asserts that a major problem in much of the criticism and theory written on minority cultures in the 1980s was their attempt to delineate and create purely formal theory of ethnic literary expression. We see these similar themes come about in Romero's nationalism and internationalism essay, where she identifies another claim for something to be done about how post-colonial theory, led by ethnic studies scholars, has been under attack, and how ethnic studies can actually offer a better alternative to academia's fascination with multiculturalism. In her essay, she's framed by the question of how to best understand the nation's instances of historical fragmentation that has marked Chicano studies with contestation, qualification, and self-critique. Next one. And published the year of her passing, Lora's first and only book, Home Front's Domesticity and Its Critiques on the Antebellum United States, enacts La Llorona's characteristics for reclamation, as it reframes domesticity and narratives to highlight Black and Indigenous women's narratives in the 19th century. In the way that Romero's narrative haunts me, Laura actually confesses that, quote, the figure of the domestic woman has haunted us for over 2 centuries because of her utility for overstabilizing the analytic terms ideology and opposition. So keeping with themes from her previous publications, she asserts that the book's goal is to inquire into the theoretical assumptions about power, resistance, and underlying debates about cultural dominance. Next slide. Within this one particular periodical, we see that last Llorona characteristic in the haunting. We see the repetition of a reframing. So within this particular piece, can you go 2 more? Okay. We have students reframing how Laura was visualized. So no longer is her life just reduced to her death, but you have students talking about the day-to-day. So in this particular piece right here, you have Adelina Burciaga, who is a junior who was part of the Casa Zapata dorm, say that Romero, she really cared about Zapata. It was important for her to make Zapata feel like a family. And within the next quote here, you see Cecilia Garcia, another student who had worked with Romero, say she was loved by her community. A lot of us Latinos looked up to her. She broke a lot of barriers. She showed, her work showed that. And here I want to make the argument that like work and the way that work is seen is dualistic for Romero. She had a way of creating maternal service, where there are other parts of the archive where students talk about how she baked cookies for them when they were at the hospital, how she made it an effort to have conversations with each student. She helped create tutoring programs for them at the Chicano Center. But you also have students acknowledging her research work. You have students acknowledging it in a way that maybe her department did not. Reading her pieces like When Something Goes Queer, relating to it and also having similar hopes for a better 1990s. Right, slide. And in this Dia de los Muertos slide, you have this reiteration of When Something Goes Queer. This is just one of many memorials where people are quoting this particular 1990s piece. It became really, alongside her picture, it became one of the more important factors that people symbolized her by. And just reiterating the quote, I hope that in the 1990s, institutional circumstances will allow intellectuals writing on minority cultures to create an alternative rhetoric of accreditation, one which they put use in transforming the educational system and making it more responsive to the needs of ethnic communities. So this really played a toll in the way people wanted to frame her. They didn't want to frame her as just someone who passed away, the professor that used to work at the English department. They framed her through her hopes and dreams, and those hopes and dreams were reiterated in her peer-reviewed work. In particular, you see the audience that did this with like the sponsorships here in the Dia de los Muertos piece, which were many of the same sponsors for different events in her memory. Among them was MECHA, the Movimiento Estudiantil Chicano Asociación, the Stanford Center for Latin American Studies, Casa Zapata, El Centro, La Raza Staff Association, many of which were the few Latinx folks on Stanford's university. And last year, as I was updating my archival investigations, I came across gender and sexuality scholar Dr. Henry Washington Jr.'s February 20th, 2022 tweet, or X. Within this piece, he wrote, with all the discussions about tenure denials lately, this is happening during the midst of like Harvard tenure denials, I've been thinking a lot about Laura Romero. What Stanford English department did to her is absolutely unconscionable. And given that like Twitter is an ever engaging academic sphere outside of just the physical academic space, education scholar Dr. Khadidra Monet Martin actually ended up sharing my 2019 master's thesis called Chicana Ghosts that speaks about Laura Romero's passing. And these tweets are really a reminder that so many scholars have made meaningful changes in academia. They're exposing the epistemic haunting, and they're trying to change the parameters of episteme within academia. Among those are the Laura Romero First Book Prize winners. So there is a book prize in her honor now. And that is really highlighting a space for intersectional research. And as we're going through, I want to reiterate that Laura Romero's archives really are an altar that reveal her active engagement at Stanford University. She really is imprinted on her students and her colleagues' lives. And Romero's epistemic haunting is just one of many Llorona-like or other folkloric-like hauntings within Chicano studies, within the humanities in general. Just as there has been a continuous timeline of intellectual repression of people of color at Stanford since the 90s, you have throughout Chicanx and Latinx studies and those within the intersections of those that scholarship that are filled with other scholars who have endured forms of epistemic haunting, and you all probably are envisioning people that you probably have have had similar experiences, right? Whether that be yourself feeling like a ghost or other folks within the academy. And this book project really highlights the tragic premature deaths as one way I make amends, as one way I do something. Gordon calls it something to be done. With ghosts haunting academia, my obligation is to speak about at least a few of them within the last 3 decades. You can go one more. So this book project highlights, on top of Laura Romero, Gloria Anzaldúa, which some of you may have heard of, the Chicana feminism, but which is lesser known for having died of diabetic complications and having not had access to healthcare while she was working at UC Santa Cruz. It also includes US Central American scholar Horacio Roque Ramirez, who ended up overdosing on Christmas Day in 2015 after dealing with a long lineage of anti-Central American sentiment in his department and homophobia. And after, as a historian himself, also carrying the weight of other ghosts and specters, as his work focused on trans refugees seeking asylum into the United States. So these are the few ghosts of this book project. And as epistemic haunting demonstrates repression present in academia, it also offers a tool to disrupt it. So I don't want to end you all on doom and gloom. There's hope. Just as Laura's quote said, the epistemic haunting itself as a methodology offers and highlights the intersectional knowledge that it represses, right? So like, yeah, there's knowledge being repressed, but it's also bringing it to light. And we can make use of it. We can acknowledge how epistemic hauntings are deconstructing power structures. We can also draw from the Chicanas reframing folkloric icons like La Llorona. Like we already know that it can be used as a theoretical framework, so let's use it as one. Let's establish a foundation to humanize individuals, to stop forms of epistemic violence, and with the goal of stopping these eminent epistemic hauntings. Learning from Laura Romero's life and death alongside a more extensive history of Chicana activism and feminist theory validates these resistance reclamations. It can help future generations recognize and protect their very own existence. And at least within my own future research, I'm leaning into these concepts of memory, of generational affect, thinking about the literal and metaphorical threads involved within memory formation. And because epistemic hauntings are a form of knowledge, and because we must listen to the ghosts and learn from them, we have to understand that we have to learn to understand the epistemic violence they endure to not become ghosts ourselves. All right, and that's it.